Today is June 14th, 2007. My name is Cassie Potasek, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Michigan, North Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
Simon Paul Schwan.
And where were you born?
I was born in Rugby, North Dakota. That's in Pierce County.
And were you born in a hospital?
Yes, I was born in the hospital.
Can you share some of your earliest childhood memories with us?
Well, I can go back to by the time when I was 4 years old because I remember my great-grandfather, John Jigger. He died in 1928, and I was born in 1924, and I remember him quite well when he was still alive. And from there we went on to my other grandfather passed away, and Vincent Volk was his name. And then we went on to starting school. I remember starting, at the time I went to school, they didn't have kindergarten, but at that time they had, the first year was like primary year. You were 6 years old when it started, but the primary year was mainly learn the language. We couldn't speak English when we started school at that time, so it was kind of difficult. But then after the second year, we got into first grade, and then school was always kind of a drag for those people living out in the country. They had, at that time, the children were always expected to do some work. We did a lot of chores. Before we went to school, and when we came home from school, we had to do chores. And during the fall of the year, and the spring of the year, a lot of the kids had to miss school because they had to help out in the field and things like that. And very young, I was only 10 years old when I was starting mowing hay and things like that. And so it's kept on going. And the year I learned to run a mower with a team of horses was probably the worst year we had in the drought of North Dakota. That was in 1934. And it started out a real nice spring, early spring, and everything was nice and green and lush. And about the middle of May, we got about 3 days of hot weather, wind from the south, about 95 degrees. And the first day, you could see batches on the hills that turned brown, and the second day they got larger, and then the third day the whole fields were completely burned up. They're just brown. And so that took care of the crop for that year. And after that, the Russian thistles started to grow, and we did harvest those with the mower for hay. We cut them for hay for the cattle. And being there was not enough feed, and the prices there was no prices to speak of for the livestock, but the government bought the cattle so they would not starve to death, I guess. Anyway, a good size, a big cow was in nice shape, brought from $8 to $10, and calves that were maybe 200-300 pounds, they couldn't ship them, so they just destroyed them and buried them on the farm, because shipping the cattle to Chicago at that time, they went to the cannery, and all this beef that the government bought that time was put into canned beef, roast canned beef. I remember the following winter at the school program, the lunch programs, we got this canned beef from the government surplus. And of course, the grasshoppers were really bad through those years. And then, of course, one of my best memories on the farm is in the fall of the year when we butchered hogs. That was a 3-day process. We killed maybe 6 hogs in one day. And the first day was butchering the hogs and cutting them up and making sausage. And you made 3 kinds of sausage. You made just the pork sausage in casings, and then your liver sausage and blood sausage, and then the head cheese. And then after the second day, the lard was rendered because the people didn't go to the store and couldn't buy Crisco or any of those oils they have now. So depending on lard, that's something that kept quite well. So after the second day, the lard was rendered. Then the third day, the byproducts from the lard, there's crystals or whatever they call them. They were put back into a boiler and lye was added, and they were boiled, and then it made into soap. So, like I said, from the start to till you were finished, it took 3 days to get the butchering done. And then, of course, school at that time too. We lived, like I told you earlier, close to the country school. We only lived about 4 blocks from school, or maybe a little less. And we walked to school, walked home for lunchtime, ate lunch at home. And then the winter time, when the weather was cold, we carried our lunch to school with, like the other kids did that come from a distance. And then, of course, the 30s, that same year in 1934, when the government bought them cattle, we had a cattle drive, what the government bought, driving to the railroad station. And we lived 8 miles south of Berwick. They were shipped out of Berwick, so there was several neighbors got together, and we had this cattle drive into the stockyards by the railroad in town, and that was probably the last cattle drive they had in that area. And getting back to field work, they wouldn't get by with that today. I was only 12 years old. I was pitching bundles. Well, I'm not the only one. Every kid was doing that, you know. And it was real manual labor, you know. But the parents kind of depended on the kids to work for them, and that was all kind of included in the farming operation. In the spring of the year, when my dad and my older brother were using the horses in the field, the younger kids, before we went to school in the mornings, we had to clean the barn and haul the manure out with a wheelbarrow, or maybe with a stone boat with one horse that was left behind. And then when we got home from school, everybody had a job. Some of the kids had to carry in water, and some maybe the coal and the wood, and then also feeding the chickens and gather the eggs and bring the cows in and help milk. And wasn't much time to do homework. By the time you're done with chores and had supper, it was time to go to bed. And then, of course, religion was very important to the German people there where I grew up. I was 14 years old before I ever met another kid that didn't speak German. You know, there was Norwegian people lived to the north of our community where I grew up. I don't know how many square miles it was. There was everybody was German Russians, and then to the north where we lived, there was Norwegian settlement. So, like I said, I was 14 years old before I met a Norwegian kid, and we became good friends. I still remember him, and so on. And the church was important every Sunday. Nobody missed Mass on Sunday. Everybody went to church, and Sundays was always, you come home from church, it was a big dinner, probably a 3-course or 4-course dinner. You had chicken soup and then mashed potatoes and and all the trimmings that went with it. And then after that, you had maybe a nice piece of pie. And that was kind of the tradition of the. We hardly ever had a big meal like that without serving soup, the first course, you know. And so my grandfather, John Jaeger, I remember him when he died in 1928. I was 4 years old, but I remember him very well. He seen him several times, and we were down to their house. They didn't live too far from us. So when he passed away, I distinctly remember it very well. And then I lost my grandfather about 2 years later. And then my father's parents, they never came to this country. It's just my father and his brother and sister, they were sent over here because they didn't have enough money for the whole family to come. And my grandmother died over there in 1927. At that time, they had this problem with the Bolshevik. I'm sorry I didn't talk to my dad more about this. It's too late now, but we could have got so much more information if we'd have just discussed that at that time. But I've heard my dad talk to my uncle several times, and different people, how the people over there during the Bolshevik time, how bad they really had it. I know several families that lost relatives over there from starvation during that time. And my grandmother died at that time, and I think that was probably her case too, you know. Where do we go from here?
Well, how about you tell me about what kind of person your great-grandfather was?
My great-grandfather, we have a lot of history because I have a cousin from Gary, Indiana, that she did all the history and tracing back relatives. He was a tall, slender man. He came into this country after the rest of the family came because my great-grandmother, she wasn't very well, and I don't know if she died from cancer or what, but when the family came, he stayed back because she wouldn't ever make the trip. And after she passed away, about 6 months later, that's when he joined the family over here. He, from that, my great grandfather, there was 1, 2, 3. My grandmother, it was her father, and there was probably about 5 in that family that came over. Other than that, just going back to the old country, I don't know too much about that, but times were bad over here too. During the Depression is when our house burned down. So I remember that I was 7 years old when we lost our house, and of course, money was so tight at that time. It was hard to get back onto your feet, you know. So we lived in poverty for many years, but I still remember those as very joyful years, you know, even though we had hardships. There was 15 children born into our family. 2 of them died as like cryptids, you know. And then I lost a sister at the age of 8. No, I'm sorry. She was not just going on 6. She was not quite 6 years old, but the time that we lost her, there was an epidemic of scarlet fever around, and some of the families were quarantined. So we had the nurse came to check their school, and everybody was okay. And she came down, being we lived close to school. There was the county nurse. And my little sister was sick, and they thought she had scarlet fever, but it wasn't. She had a appendix problem. We didn't know that. And of course, my mother always had her home remedies. When anybody got cold, or had a bad cold or sore throat or got sick, she'd really warm them up and try to make them sweat, you know, and sweat out. And that was the wrong thing to do once you had an appendix. So the next day, the doctor came out, and then they took her to the hospital. It was already ruptured, and she passed away the next night.
Can I ask you some more questions about
okay.
your family?
Yeah.
Do you remember the funeral of your sister at all? Or anything like that? Your sister's funeral when she passed away? Do you remember it very clearly?
When who passed away?
Your sister?
Oh, yeah. That was in 1940. In, I think it was in late January, early February 1940. Got any questions?
Well, did you have a funeral or a ceremony of any sort?
Oh, yes, yes. At that time, they bring the casket home with the body home into the house, and all the neighbors would come, and we had a wake, you know, for 2 nights, and then they had their funeral at that Fulda St. James Cemetery at the Fulda Church there.
You mentioned that your mother had a lot of home remedies. You mentioned your mom did home remedies
Yes.
when people got sick. What were some of those?
Well, I remember this one time I came home from school really sick, but it was we was making hot lunch in the school. We had a kitchen, and every day some different kids were appointed to make hot lunches, and we were making the group I was with. We were making hot chocolate, and we were mixing cocoa and sugar and water and making it into chocolate, and we ate too much, and I really got sick. So when I got home, the first thing she did was she gave me a big glass of soda water. That was one of her remedies, and that brought that chocolate right up. You know? And I tell you, I couldn't smell or taste, couldn't stand the smell of cocoa or chocolate for about 10 years, but I finally got over it again, you know. But some of her remedies, not that she had any formula of any kind of medication or anything like that, but Vaseline or methylene, you know, if somebody had a cold or sore neck, well, you get rubbed down with that around the throat, and you'd also, she'd get you to bed and warm you up and try to get you to really sweat out that cold, and most of the time it worked, you know. We lived, you know, 18 miles from Rugby. That was the closest place where there was a doctor or a hospital. So people didn't go to see the doctor very often. It was mostly lived out at home until they got over it, you know. And my grandparents lived about a mile from us, not quite a mile the way the crow flies, and we quite often, like for Thanksgiving or Christmas, we went to her house and with a sled, and I remember so well. We were all bedded down in the sleigh, you know, and covered up, and nobody's supposed to peek out, but I always did, you know. And a sleigh with a team of horses, everything is so quiet and it's so smooth. When you're laying down and looking up at the stars, it looked like you were standing still and the stars were moving, you know. It was different. Getting back to farming, that was all done by horses at that time. I was 12 years old when I was plowing with a two-bottom plow. They called it the gang plow, with 5 horses. You know, it had 3 abreast behind and the 2 lead teams out in front. And same with harvest. In 1935, I was 11 years old, and I was riding a binder for the whole harvest. At that time, we were pulling 2 binders behind one tractor, and you had to have somebody on the binder to trip the bundle carrier, or the bundles all come out in kind of a straight row. Every time you come to a row, you dump the bundles. And then, of course, when the thrashing time came, that was always kind of an exciting time. A lot of activities, all the extra men around, and the smell of tar on the belt of the thrashing machine, and it had kind of an aroma that's stays with you for the rest of your life. And then, of course, you bring the grain up and put it shovel it into the granary. Very few people had grain handling equipment at that time. Like there was no augers, or there was a few elevators. People had some elevators, but most of it was done by hand. When they scooped it into the bin by hand. And the same way when you haul it back out to haul it to town. In 1937, I remember I was 13 years old, and it must have been in October. I was home for 2 weeks hauling grain to town, one load a day. My dad would load it up either in the evening or early in the morning, and with a team of horses, I'd go 8 miles with a load of grain to town, and take it to town and get it unloaded. And there was a grocery store in town. Oh, I got 15 cents to buy my lunch. I could buy a little pack of crackers and a can of Vienna sausages for 50. I mean, the Vienna sausages, I think, cost a dime, and the crackers cost a nickel. So that was my lunch just about every day for those 2 weeks that I hauled grain to town. And I hauled 50 bushels to a load. I hauled 700 bushels into town, and now my son takes one load into town, which is about 800 or 900 bushels at one load, you know. But I enjoyed farm life, and at that time, I think the people that came over here and homesteaded had the idea that everybody's going to keep on farming. So very few of the older people or older kids went on to higher school after they passed the 8th grade. That was about the extent of the school. My brother, he went to high school, my older brother. He went to Collegeville, Minnesota. There was 2 other boys from the parish. They went to Collegeville with the intentions that they were going to become priests, but it turned out that none of them did. They went through high school, and then they went on their own ways. But I was an altar boy myself. At the age of 10, I started serving Mass for the priests there in our parish, and of course, being that the school was close to the church, so anytime there's a wedding or a funeral where they needed altar boys, we always got an excuse from the school to go serve. And the weddings were very enjoyable, and but the funerals, I remember my first funeral I served as an altar boy. It was pretty hard to do, you know. I just didn't like to be around the caskets for some reason or another. But and then, of course, the school that I went to, I have that picture of all the school kids there. Some of the time there was like 30 kids in that one room school, and one teacher for all the kids. So. But the classes were different. The teacher had by her desk she had like a bench or somewhere that whenever she had a class, and the blackboard behind her, and so if the 7th or 8th grade had a class, the other kids were listening in, and we learned quite a lot from what the other kids had for class. I remember myself very well. That helped me a lot.
What kind of games did you play?
Well, in school, it was depends on the season. In the fall and the spring, when the weather was nice, we always had pretty much a ball game, or quite often we play like kick the can, or I don't forget how they call it, Andy I over it, and tag. The school teacher would come out sometimes, and the whole school would play tag. Run from one side to another, and hide and seek. That's a game we mostly played at home in the evenings, or if we had company or some kids come, we quite often played hide and seek. And another thing, in the spring of the year, after we had a good thaw and there was water in the potholes, maybe there's from the school there was a pothole, maybe a couple blocks there, and the ice froze over, so everybody's out skating on this pond. and we had a hill, was just a little past our farm. Is once, not all the time, but now and then the teacher would give us permission at during noon hour to go down in the wintertime. When kids that had sleds or something like that, we walk up the hill and ride down on the sled. I remember a neighbor kid got a pair of skis. They were just wood skis. An older man had them, and very simple. And he sold it to this kid for 25 cents. And so the very first Sunday we had these skis. Our neighbors had a high hill. That was about a mile from our place. And the whole neighborhood was up on that hill, and everybody tried to use these one pair of skis, so. And of course, it was fun. Everybody put them on and went about 10 feet, and they fell down, and the ski went all the way down to the bottom of the hill. They ended up spending more time fetching back the skis than they did skiing, And to the south of us, about a mile, there was what they call a alkali lake, and that had water in most of the year. It was shallow, but so that froze over, and it had a good skating on there. It was about a half a mile lake, So quite often, kids on a Sunday afternoon would gather there and for just doing some ice skating. And
did your parents have a lot of people over to visit? Were they really social? On Sunday afternoons, did they have visitors or anything?
oh yeah, you mean like neighbors visiting? Oh yes, that was every Sunday. Somebody came, or my folks went to another neighbor's house, and people visiting back and forth. That was one of the main things, because there was no television or no radio at that time, So I suppose they had to keep talking and keep the news going around. And another thing, at that time, the Catholic people, they never celebrated a birthday. It was always they celebrate their name's day. To say my mom's name was Barbara, and the feast of Saint Barbara was on December 4th. So they always had a big party. There was a lot of food and drink, and somebody come in with accordion and then have dance, dancing. Excuse me. So, and everybody in the neighborhood, especially, I remember we had a neighbor, his name was Sylvester, and his feast namesday was December 31st, the night before New Year's. So my folks always went there, and all the neighbors around there had a big celebration. And another big feast day was the Feast of the Three Kings. So that was celebrated. Anybody had a name like that, like, you know the names of the three kings?
I don't.
Okay, but they were. There was Casper, Melker, and they call them Balter. So anybody had that name, they'd celebrate that, and that was a big celebration. They always had schnapps and beer and everything that went with it.
Did you make your own alcohol? Your own schnapps or anything?
Yeah, it was illegal, but we made homemade beer. You could make beer, and it was not like the bottled beer. It was you wouldn't get a headache from like that like you do from this bottled beer. Later on I was told that the reason why from the brewery beer, they said they add ether to uh, as a preservative to extend the life of it. They said that's what gives you the headache. But then the homemade beer, that was always sometimes it was the drink with the meal. I remember before going to school, anytime would have like pork and potatoes and sauerkraut, the beverage for that meal was either tea or beer. And no matter how old you were, you got whatever was served. Uh, I know I wasn't going to school yet, and for lunch, if they had sauerkraut and the pork, I'd have a glass of beer. There was not one alcoholic in our family. And then, of course, the spirited stuff, the alcohol, that was homemade too. And we had a little still. I remember how that worked. The ingredients was like some kind of dried fruit, maybe prunes and apricots and then they put rye or wheat in there and let it ferment and tell it every day you'd have to take the foam off the top and let it work until it's all done working, and then they put it through this boiling process. And it's a special made boiler with copper coils coming out, and it went into a barrel of ice cold water. We added in the wintertime snow or ice, and it's the steam from this brew that they were boiling, the steam and come through the cold, and it condensed, and that was the alcohol. And they made 190 proof stuff, so it was pretty powerful. So once you had that alcohol made, you couldn't drink it straight because it was too powerful. So you mix, burn some sugar to caramelize it, and add that to the waters, and then it was 3 to 1, three parts water and sugar, and 1 part of this 190 proof, and that was your wedding drink. Usually for a wedding, that was, or celebrations, that was their main drink, and besides the beer.
Can you tell me some more about the Depression?
Oh, I guess I can. Like I said before, after in 1934, I remember so well because there was absolutely no crop and no feed for the livestock. Um, After everything burned up, then the Russian thistles start to grow, and we harvest them and cut them for hay, what we could salvage. And the dust, we had terrible dust storms. I remember where my folks had company on a Sunday afternoon, and around maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it got so dark from dust blowing that they had to light a lamp. And in the school, the same way. We had some days in the afternoon where the storm, dust storm, was so bad that she had to dismiss school because there was no lighting in school. We didn't have electricity out in the country at that time, and it was just too dark. So she dismissed school maybe 1 hour or so before the regular time. Because anyway, getting back to the Depression, there was some government commodities that were dished out. We lived quite well. We had mostly our own potatoes and garden stuff. We grew garden stuff during the Depression. We had to carry water, but potatoes and pumpkins and watermelon. We pickled like 50-gallon barrel of pickled watermelons and made sauerkraut. And then we had our own eggs and butter and cream. So as far as food goes, about all we had to buy is maybe flour and sugar for the staples. The rest that we got by with, but we got some government commodities like dried fruit, or even some fresh fruit like oranges or different things like that the government handed out. I suppose they were in a surplus in the areas where they grew them at that time also. So as far as living out in the country, we probably were a little better off than some people in town. My wife grew up in the state of Michigan, and they were town folks, city folks, and they actually, even though they were working, but the money was so hard to come by, and the wages were very low. So they had really didn't have the food supplies that we did in the cities. And as far as labor goes, at that time, $1 a day for a man was a day's wages. And during the winter months, when there's no demand for labor, I know some of the different fellows would work for a neighbor, help do chores and stuff like that, and they didn't get any pay. All they got was their room and board and a little tobacco. They were smoking, so they couldn't afford to buy tobacco, so the guy furnished them what they called either Dukes or Bull Durham. Was a little cloth bag that you buy. That cost a nickel at that time, so it wasn't that expensive. But my sister, she was the third one in the family. In 1933, she went to the convent. She's still alive today. Now she's at the St. Francis Convent in Hankinson, North Dakota. So for them to come home like at Christmas time, it was always pretty difficult because the railroad, we were on the Great Northern Railroad at Berwick, and that didn't go down. It went to Fargo, but it didn't go down to Hankinson, so they had to go on that other line from Harvey down, which they got down to Hankinson, and so there was some other girls from the Balta area, and they used to ride together down to Harvey and take the train from there on down. And I remember in 1935 when my sister came home for Christmas vacation. They had car problems and it was cold, and they never got home with the car, but they got to one of the neighbors that lived about 5 miles from us, and it was a Christmas Eve when they were, when she was coming home, and my brother and my dad went to get her, and then they had these car problems. So they came with the neighbor when they came for midnight mass. They came a little earlier, so they got home probably about 11 o'clock. And then, of course, even out in the country, everybody came from miles around for midnight mass. This is something before I can really remember, but my dad told me, I forget what year it was. It was an open winter. The weather was real mild, and they got out of midnight mass, and the whole sky was lit up to the southwest of them, and there was a big prairie fire, going, and so everybody got in their work clothes and hit for that place. Was about 6 miles to the southwest of the church. And at that time, there was a lot of grass, so the fires got started. It was hard to get it under control, and everybody was out after midnight mass and fighting fire. And even after I got a little older, I remember during the night one time, a neighbor came and woke up my dad, and he told him about there's a fire going and they needed help. And he was riding horseback around the neighbors, waking the neighbors up, and get some help to get the fire under control. But getting back to the Depression, money was hard to come by. Like you said, wages were low. I know the school teacher, she got $30 a month for her efforts of teaching school, and she usually boarded at a neighbor's hut. I remember the one teacher, she had to walk about a mile every day from where she was boarding, and I think she had to pay something like $8 a month for board and room. So take that out of $30 didn't leave her very much, I remember my first teacher, she came from Devil's Lake. Her name was Lena Litzinger, and I remember her very well because she was my first teacher. I remember all my school teachers. My third grade teacher was Johnny Hilsendigger, and then he became a prominent businessman up at Rugby after he got out of the teaching profession. And we never got, well, we did get to town. 4th of Julys were always very well celebrated, even during the Depression. Each child got a nickel, or if we got a dime, we got a lot, you know. Anyway, in 1936, the rugby and the town's West Towner and Minot, they were celebrating 50 years of when they founded the town, 50-year celebration. And I don't know if you ever knew Gene Autry or not. You probably heard of him, but he was a movie star, a cowboy movie star. Well, Minot got Gene Autry to come to Minot for their celebration as an attraction. I don't know how much Minot had to pay to him to come there, but Towner had their celebration on the 4th, and Minot had the big celebration on the 5th. So Towner got permission from Minot for Gene Autry to come down just to ride in the parade. And Towner had to pay him $1,500 just to ride in the parade. Yeah, there was I think it's Gabby Hayes, one of his guys that was with him. There was Gabby Hayes and Gene Autry, and there was another guy with him. There were 3 guys, but so that was one of the highlights on the 4th of July in 1930. That was 1936. Yeah. In 1935, we celebrated we used to celebrate the 4th of July out in the country, you know, by the church would celebrate the 4th, and then maybe someplace at the neighborhood. We live close to the church, so they used our barn. But I think that was in 1933 when the 4th of July was celebrated at the church, and it started out with having a church service and a mass in the morning, and then they had a dinner, served a dinner, a church dinner, and then they had some concession stands down in our farm. In the garage, they had some place where they're selling firecrackers, and there's a couple of different things. And then up in the barn, they used the hayloft, and they put in a new floor up there for a dance. They had a dance up there. They danced both in the afternoon and then in the evening. You know, about 6 o'clock, everybody went home, did chores, and most of the people did. And then they came back after that and celebrated throughout into the night again. You know. In 1935, we celebrated the 4th of July at that church out at Fulda. We had our regular priest has gone on vacation. He was gone for about 2 months. He went to Yellowstone and out to Washington. And so we had a young priest there from Canada, and he kind of promoted this 4th of July celebration in 1935. And we had a barn on the property. They put in a floor for dancing in the horse barn, and we were in such a drought in 34, and then 35 started out the same way. And by the 4th of July, everybody had kind of give up hopes. You know, the grain was under stress and was really dry. And that night, a cloud bank built up and it let loose, and we had 6 inches of rain that night. And the next morning we got out. Every pothole in the lake was full of water. I've never seen so much water in my life as at that time. And then the crops revived, and it turned out pretty good. The durum crop and the barley and the oats and the corn, everything was good, except the spring wheat got got affected with the rust, and it took care of that. So the spring wheat, the stand was good and everything, but the wheat itself was not much good.
You said your house burned down when you were young. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I remember. It was 1931. We were in school. It happened in September. In school had started, and I remember the school teachers looked out the window facing to the south, and our house was just stretched straight south from there. She says, "Oh, she says, it looks like Schwan's house is on fire," and so she took the eighth grade kids with her, and they went down to see if they could be of any help, but it was too far gone. And so after they came back, my younger sister, younger than me, and we asked her if we could go home because we didn't feel like studying anymore for that day. But we went home, and the house was fire was still going pretty good, but everybody in the neighborhood was there and carrying water and whatever they could do. But so after the house burned down, we lost everything. Um, the first night, some of the kids stayed in different neighborhoods, but then after the next day, we all lived over to my grandmother's house. We stayed there, and then the first Sunday, this must have been probably on a Friday or so when it burned, or the first Sunday, my dad and my uncle, they took the car and they drove out and they looked around and they found a house that was for sale and could be moved. And then, like I said, at the thrashing time, people had cook cars. So there was two different neighbors that happened to have cook cars, and they moved them onto our place. So we had one place, we kind of made it like a bunkhouse out of, and the other one we used to get our meals in. And so we stayed in them cook cars till they had the house moved on and livable again. And it got pretty cold, I remember, before we got to live in the house, because being it happened in September, and then they had to clean up all the debris. And with the house they moved on, they dug a basement for it, and they had to pour cement walls first, and they set the house down. And after that, they had to do a lot of work because needed new windows and different things. But must have been pretty close to the last part of November or so before we got to move into the house. And that's like I said, we lost all our pictures and everything that we had before at that time. So we haven't got hardly any pictures or anything prior to the fire of the house. When my aunt got married, my mother's sister, they had the wedding at her house, and to make room, they had an organ. So they gave the organ to us, and we had that probably 2 years or so when the house burned, so that organ burned too, you know. But it happened in the afternoon, so it could have been lots worse if it had happened during the night, because it was a small house, but there was one bedroom upstairs. My brother and I were sleeping up there, so if it would have happened during the night, we'd have had to get out through the window, I guess, you know.
Do you know how the fire started?
Well, I guess they determined it was a faulty chimney, you know. That's how it got started. And my dad was just going to go to town, and he backed the car out of the garage, which was a little distance from the house. And when he backed the car out, he saw there was the smoke coming out through the roof, and so they got everybody out, and they got out some of the stuff that they could before it got to, but there was no life lost. So that was had baby sister. She was born in July that year, and so if this was in September, she was pretty small. I remember they had her slipping in the car when we came home from school, and but the neighbors, everybody was real good to us. They gave us clothes and give us everything that we needed, bedding and different things. And that was all donated by the neighbors. Well, after we had this different home that we lived in, and there was after that was 3 more children were born. But anyway, my younger brother Morris, he was the first one born in the house that we moved in there after the one that burned down, and he was born during the day, and he was born at home. The roads were blocked. It was in the wintertime. It was in December, and it was snow, so there was no way we could get a car out on the road. And like I said, we came home from school, and there was a new kid in the house. I always tease my brother about that. Yeah, and we had a midwife there. So the next morning, he got a bath, and in the wash tub, the midwife, of course, they put him in down with a blanket, you know, and into the water, and all the kids were standing around. Must have been 5 or 6 kids standing around the wash tub watching him get in the bath, you know. And the midwife, she was a younger woman in the neighborhood. I remember my dad and I, we were taking her home with the bobsled and team of horses. I was 8 years old, and he let me drive the team. Of course, he was standing close by, but
Do you know any interesting stories about your other siblings' births?
about what?
When your other siblings were born? Your brothers and sisters, when they were born, are there any other interesting stories?
Oh yes, my brother David, he was born in 1928. He was born in the hospital, and we still had a Model T. They didn't have a top on at that time. And my dad and my sister and I, we were going into town to go to the hospital. But before we went to Rugby, he stopped at a towner. He had to go and get some parts for a mower. And then from there we went up to Rugby, and I remember the wind took my cap off and blew my hat off, and so he stopped the car, and I ran back to pick up my hat, and I was, like you said, 1928, so I was about 4, and it seemed an awful long ways from the car to where my hat was. So we got up to the hospital and saw my baby brother, Um, and then I had another sister was born in the hospital. She was born on the 4th of July. And then my youngest sister was born in 1937. I remember that real well because the weather was really hot and dry, and it was too hot in the house. You couldn't sleep at night. And this one night, my dad went to town to the hospital to see my mom, and we were all sitting out on the steps on the porch where it was a little cooler. And it was almost midnight, and we heard Dad, the car coming, so we all ran in and went to bed. So he didn't know we were up, but it was, we had so much hot weather in those, especially in 1936 and 37, that the house, no air conditioning or anything, and it was really hot in there at night. And then another thing I'd like to tell you, but we used to take the milk cows about a mile from home. There was about 2/4 of land. There was this grass, and it belonged to the county. And there's a couple neighbors, and my dad, they did used to rent that. So we'd all bring our cows out to this ground and graze them and herd the cows. And we did that. I did that for about 3 or 4 summers. Every summer, in the mornings you get up and milk the cows and have breakfast, and about 7 o'clock you get the cows out on the road and take them a mile west to the grazing pasture. There was no fence there, so we were there. Each kid had a horse, so we had to watch them, and so they'd just stay on this particular piece of property. But just quite often we were mucking around and playing with, doing something, and the first thing we knew, the cows were in the neighbor's wheat field, And then, like you said too, I couldn't speak English, or none of our kids ever spoke English before we went to school, because everybody was speaking German at home. And I still remember the first prayer that my parents taught me. I remember we were thrashing this one time, and my mom and they were cooking for the thrashers in the summer kitchen. That time they had a summer kitchen to keep the house cool, I guess. They did all the cooking in the summer kitchen. And it was getting late at night. It was already dark out, and I remember my mom asked my dad to take my sister and me over to the house and put us to bed. So he took us over there, and we said our prayers together with him. And the prayer, I still remember that. It goes like this: Ich bin klein, maar hartelijk rijk. Es kommt niemand drin wohnen als Jeselei. Liebs Jeselei, komm zu mir, mach ein frommes Kind aus mir.
Can you translate that?
Pardon?
Can you say what it means?
Well, I can try, but it's kind of hard to explain. But ich bin klein, that means I am very little. My heart is fine, and nobody can live in there but the child Jesus. And the child Jesus coming to my heart and make a free child out of me is something like that, My right now my German is kind of rusty, but my Spanish isn't much better. We spent 17 winters down in South Texas, and there was a lot of Spanish people down there. So living with them among the Mexicans, we kind of picked up some Spanish. We were right about 8 miles from the Mexican border. We went to Mexico quite a few times every winter. All the winter Texans, they call them winter Texans, the people that come down there, they go across the border. Some days it was just more people from the north over in Mexico. There was Mexican people. But we enjoyed it. The weather was beautiful. It was down in far Texas. I was there the first time in 1946, and I thought if I ever retired, that's the place to go. I was there in December, and they were picking grapefruit, and the whole valley was just, full of grapefruit, and the aroma of fresh fruit, you could smell it over the whole valley. It was just beautiful. So about 40 years later, or maybe 50 years later, we came back, and it wasn't the same. All these people that came down for the winter and had all these trailer parks, and the grapefruit trees were bulldozed out and made into trailer parks, and it was sad. I've always been a farmer in heart, and I hate to see good land being destroyed by putting on buildings or property or putting on a pavement. And it's the same way down there. The water is getting hotter every year, but they got more and more cement and blacktop every year. That gets hot. And then.
Can you tell me about your parents?
Oh yes, my parents came to this country. My mother came. She was 4 years old at the time when she arrived, and I think they came in 1896, I believe. And then my father came later on. His family never came over. But his brother and him, my father and a sister, they were sent over by their parents. They didn't have enough money for everybody to come. And my dad, he had an uncle that was already over here before he came. My dad didn't come till about 1908, and my uncle had been here probably 8 or 10 years at that time. So they had a family over here that they could come to. My dad told me when they left over there, they could see those problems coming ahead. He had been approached. He was 14 at the time, and he had been approached before. They wanted to join the military, and they promised him a lot of good things, but he didn't want to join the military. And at that time, from the area that left South Russia over there, my dad came from the Strasbourg area, and it must have been close, not too far from Odessa, because they hauled some of their grain that they thrashed, they hauled into Odessa. But at the time they were leaving, there were quite a few families that went to South Africa to settle. Some went to Argentina, and they had considered maybe South Africa too, because that was, closer by, and not such a far trip. We had a neighbor out here at Berwick then later on that they had settled in Argentina, and I don't know how many years they were down there, but they eventually came back up here and settled around the Karlsruhe area. When my mother came and my grandparents, they came to South Dakota when they first came over here. They had friends they knew in South Dakota, and they stayed the first winter in Aberdeen. Then the next year they came up to Pierce County, and they homesteaded some land, got the paperwork and everything done. And then they made the trip back to Aberdeen again for the second winter. And then the next spring they came back, and then they got buildings up and the house up in the estate. Can you imagine with a horse and buggy travel to Aberdeen, South Dakota, even today, you know? I don't know how long it took them, but I guess they stop along the way, like if there's a farmhouse someplace, they asked them if they could stay for the night. And, you know, people were pretty generous at that time, I suppose, for travelers. So my grandfather Volk, as my mother's dad, the land that he owned, that's where the church was built on. He donated, I think, either 15 or 20 acres of land to the church that the church was built on. That's the Fulda Church and St. Anselm Cemetery. The first child that was buried in that cemetery out there belonged to Albright family. I forget what his name would be in English. It was in German it's pronounced Wanneville. But I remember that old man Albright. He was the parade marshal. They lived in town, and they were a ranching family, and he was the parade marshal. So he rode with Gene Autry in the parade, and it was their child. This the first child was buried in that cemetery. My best friend is buried there. August Paul. His mother died in childbirth when they had a pretty. I think there was like 6 or 7 children, and the oldest one was only like 16 years old, and he was August. He was about the third one in the family, and he became real close to me, and he stayed at our place quite a lot. And he had some foster parents. He lived with them until he was 18, and he joined the Navy in the fall of 1940. And he came home in March, came to our place for on a furlough. And after that, he was shipped to Hawaii. He died in Hawaii. He died before Pearl Harbor. We don't know what he died from or what he died in 1941. And in his funeral, they brought the body back, and it was buried in the last part of July in 1941. But it was before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was just like a brother to me. He buried out there at the Fulda Cemetery. Um, the priest that was there, he came in 1924 in September. I was born in February 1924, and I guess he came, I think, in September, and he was out there then for, I believe it was maybe 1964 or so when he retired. So he was out there for many years at the same parish, and he came from Germany. I got a book here where I just read where in 1928 he went back for a visit to Bavaria. So he is from that part of Germany. And also in that history, there was some of the first pioneers that came there was Simon Bush and Ignaz Wohler, and my great uncle Jacob Schwan, and my grandpa Volk, and my uncle Jagers. They're the ones that started the church out there. And of course, by the time they got the church going, it started out small, and then has to build up, community build up, and then at one time there was 300 people in the parish, and right now there's no people there anymore. The church is closed. They closed it last summer, and I guess the bishop said they can have it there for 5 years, which they can use it if they keep it up for weddings or funerals or something like that. And it's the population of North Dakota in the rural areas just getting too thin. It just can't sustain that. There was over 100 families there when I was there. My dad told me that the bishop at that time, they needed a parish house for a priest. He said they'd give him a permanent priest. He said, if you build a house, the bishop said, I'll give you a priest forever. And here 2 years ago, we were out when they were closing the church. I told that the bishop we have now, that what it was, the words that was said about 100 years ago. But things change, Okay.
Were your church services in German?
Pardon?
Were church services in German?
No. The Roman Catholics, everything was in Latin. The service were in Latin, but he gave the sermons in German. Then later on, when there was more kids getting education, he'd give the Sunday sermon first in German and then in English, But he was High German from Bavaria, Germany. He spoke a little different than we did, but we grew up with that. I could understand every word that he said, even though we spoke a little different, There were some of the boys, Fred Wohler, he was an altar boy there, and they were close friends with the priest. So when he was in the service during World War II and over in Germany, and he was an interpreter for the army, And I met another fellow from Orange, North Dakota. He was the same way. He was in the army over there in Germany, and asked him to be an interpreter, which worked out very well. And
Can you tell me anything else about the war? What else do you remember about World War II?
the war, well, that's something too. When people from Germany went into Russia, they said they wouldn't have to serve in the army, but later on that was changed. But when they got over here in America, then uh, I have some relatives, some of the Chagers that were in the army in World War I. They were, I think he was born over the old country yet, but he was a young boy when he came over here. But he served in the U.S. Army, and he was over in France during World War I. And then, of course, when World War II came along, everybody was subject to the draft, and I was drafted myself. I had a crippled foot. I had my foot crushed when a horse fell on me in 1940. It just happened about 3 or 4 days before my sister died, and I knew it was something bad, but my dad looked at it and he says, "Well, we better take you to the doctor." I said, "Well, I guess it'll be all right." Is that my neighbor boy, his horse fell with him, and he said it hurt for a day and he got over it, but mine never got better. It was crushed. So about a year later, I had to go to Fargo, and they did some surgery and got it pretty good, but it was never the same, So with that foot, I'd never made the grade when I got down to Fort Snelling. Didn't pass my test for the physical test for the Army, so I was in 4F. And then after that, I went to California and worked in the shipyards. I thought I'd do some defense work, and I was out there from the fall of 44 until the spring of 45, and I came back to help my dad on the farm. And then, of course, in May, Germany surrendered, so the war over in Europe was over with, and then it went on until in August when the Japanese surrendered. Yes, my father told me that when the Bolshevik took over, it was really tough for the people that were left over there. The starvation was so great. They took all the food from them and closed up the borders. My father had an uncle and an aunt. They were pretty well to do. They owned a little property over there, but they wanted to live out the few years they had left to live. But when the Bolshevik took over, they burned down their house, and not only burned the house, they threw them into the fire. And I have some friends that their grandmother too over there died doing that from starvation. My grandmother died during that time over there. I'm not sure if she died from starvation or not, but I know she did. From what I gather from my father and my uncle, that she did die a very nice death somehow or another. They didn't talk any more about it than they had to, I guess, but at least they never told us kids about it. The reason I found this out is what my dad was talking to some other people about it. Later on, there was a relative that came over. He was a nephew of my grandfather Volk. he came over about this time when the Bolshevik was coming into power, or just before that, and he was trying to collect money to buy some guns to take over there. My grandmother, he stayed at my grandmother's house, and he had a couple of real large suitcases, and she said he wouldn't let nobody know about this, but one day she opened up the suitcases, and he had bought guns that he was taking back. They knew this problem was going to show up, but I don't know. We never heard about him anymore. He probably got the guns confiscated and probably got executed himself, you know. I have a relative, his name was Frazen, his mother was a Schwan. He became a bishop over in the Ukraine, and when the Bolshevik took over, things were really bad, and he was arrested several times. One time he was arrested because he's given away the clothing from an old priest that had passed away. He gave it to some poor people, and they said he couldn't do that without permission. So he got put in prison, and in 1937, that's not so long ago for me because I was 13 years old, and he was put on kind of a kangaroo court, and he was executed that same day. And that was more or less just because he was a Christian, you know. Joseph Stalin got into power. There was a lot more people that died under Joseph Stalin than we'd really realize. I have some Polish friends, and I had a friend in Texas. He was in a concentration camp when he was 13 years old. He passed away here a couple of years ago, and at his funeral I talked to his son, and he said that the parents died from starvation because the little food they got, they had the two boys who were in the concentration camp with them. They gave it to the boys that they would survive. Well, apparently our troops of the United States must have come across this concentration camp during World War II and conquered this territory. And he came to America, but during wartime, the United States would not take any immigrant people or anything. So when he came to San Francisco on a ship, the United States got Mexico to accept him, and he lived down there for 13 years. And then later on he came up, and he was a newspaper man, printing a Polish newspaper in Chicago. I knew him real well, and he was a pretty good friend of mine, and he was just a little man, but from what I gather, you know, what he went through during the World War II, I was surprised that he was still alive. And he's a smart man. He could speak about 5 or 6 different languages. He speaks Polish, English, and Spanish, and Russian, and Polish. I think he even spoke Jewish language, you know. I'm still the first generation is born over here from my immigrant parents. I'm glad that they came to America, and they enjoyed life over here. I quite often think of Lawrence Welk. He's a short-tailed relation of ours, you know. His mother was a Schwan. She's a aunt to my dad, you know. So it gives a kind of a good feeling that the people, I don't know how long it's going to be, that they had a good life after they got to America. And they were all pretty much patriotic. My dad always insisted on, anytime there was election, we go and insisted that we go and vote. He says, this is your privilege to vote, and we better use it, because a lot of the countries, they don't have that. And I'm so thankful that we had got such a good country to live in. Like I said, if my dad would have gone to South Africa, things would have been probably different, turned out different too. My dad, when he came here, the ship he was on, there was him and I think two other girls that had some kind of a disorder in the eyes. I forget what they call it, but they wouldn't be able to come into the country here. So they went into England, got off the ship in England, and they had some kind of surgery. It cleared up that whatever eye problems they had, and then it held them up about 2 weeks. So they came back later, but there was two girls from one family. Their name was Burkhardt, I guess, and he was one of them. I think it was just the three of them. Because if they'd have got over to Ellis Island and got off, they would have been shipped back. And being that he came later than my brother and my sister, and he was out of money, so there were some people in New York from the old country that they knew, and so he told me that they had to send a telegram to my uncle, and he had to send him $50 so he could continue his trip from New York out to Berwick. My uncle lived at Berwick, had homesteaded there.
When did you meet your wife?
You really want to know? Yeah, I met my wife. She's from the state of Michigan. In 1946, we were stormed in up here in North Dakota. We lived at Candu, North Dakota at that time, and the roads were so blocked, and no trains could go, and the highways were blocked. And I joined a club called the Curry Club, is writing letters. You know, I don't know how exactly how it went, but you send your name and address into, it was through the St. Anthony Messenger. It's you join the Curry Club, and they give your name or address to some of the other participants, and then you start writing letters. So you get a letter from somebody else, and from Florida or from New York or California, and we wrote back and forth, and then we got writing letters back and forth, and then that fall I went down to Michigan and I met her, and we got along pretty good, and we got engaged, and I went to California, and then a year later, in 47, we decided to get married, and she decided she'd come to live in North Dakota, and better wonderful wife and a great mother to my 7 children, and we've had a good life together. We went back and forth to Michigan many times. First few winters, before any of the kids went to school, we went back to Michigan every winter. Her brother had a service station and doing some car repair work, and I worked for him during the winter months. And when our oldest girl was about 7 years old, one time she made a remark. She says, "Why don't we go on a trip sometime?" She says. I said, "Oh, look, you're only 7 years old and you've been across the Great Lakes 7 times." And she said, "Oh, I don't mean down to Michigan. I mean we'll go to France or someplace like that, you know." But our kids were all good travelers, and even though we had 7, we still went back and forth, and they came out here. Her dad always had a lot of interest in Native Americans, and of course they came out west in 1946 to Yellowstone and to the Black Hills, and he really enjoyed the western scenery and the western atmosphere. So that's the extent of we're going to be married 60 years in November this year, so I guess we could say we had a pretty good married life.
When you got married, did you have a really traditional wedding?
We didn't have a real big wedding, no. We got married down in Carroll, Michigan. I went down there, we got married, and more or less like a family affair. We went on a honeymoon, we went to Corpus Christi, Texas. She had some friends that from Michigan moved down there. We went down to see them, and it was a really enjoyable trip. I had a new convertible car at that time, and I drove it on the beach of the Gulf of Mexico, and I thought it was really great. And it was beautiful weather, you know. It wasn't after Thanksgiving, and of course the weather was so nice down there. Well, I think it's important for the younger generation to learn about the people that sacrificed and whatever they did to come to America, so the people would have a better life over here. And I hope everything I did in my lifetime is is better than when I received it. I know my farming operation, I got the land in better condition than it was when I bought it, you know. So I hope I can continue down the generation and from generation to generation. And
Are there any other stories you'd like to share with us?
I can't think of any that. I think we'll call it a day.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Huh?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
I'm glad I could do it. That when they first started this German from Russia, I know they interviewed a man from Rugby. I know him real well. He was our neighbor, and I think at that time they had a video, not a video, but a tape on a just a tape, and he was talking everything in German, you know. So I knew that man real well too.